Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is February 1st, 2016. The Iowa caucuses have taken place today. Unfortunately, the show's being pre-recorded on January 31st, so I'm unable to comment on the outcome of the election since we don't know it when the show is being recorded. But if you're listening to the show now, you're able to go and check and see who won the Iowa caucus. And speaking to you from a little more than 24 hours in the past, I hope and pray that we are not in the midst of, or you're not listening to this broadcast in the midst of a Hillary Clinton Iowa victory. That is the worst of all possible outcomes. So we're hoping that doesn't take place, but we're going to try to, regardless of that, whether or not that is taking place, we're going to try to put out some information that will at least prevent it in New Hampshire if we can. We're going to talk about a number of different issues tonight, not only Hillary Clinton, not only Bill Gates, also, not only Robert Ford, a lot of individuals in our crosshairs tonight. We're going to talk about a number of other issues that are in the news and try to round things up because we've got some interesting information coming out next week as well that you'll just have to tune in to see. It's going to be a very interesting broadcast. And not only that, we're going to start moving our direction in the area of action, right? Moving our focus in the area of actual political change. So our list of demands will be discussed in the coming weeks. So I've been mentioning that in the past. So let's jump right in. But before we do, I want to remind all the listeners that you can catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here at ucy.tv. You can access the show's personal webpage at ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. And if you're interested in my work, then of course you should go to activistpost.com, naturalblaze.com, and if you're interested in my work specifically, BrandonTurbeville.com is the website that you should go to. That's the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the archive versions of this show. You can find links to the radio website. You can find contact information, events information. You can also find free copies of my book, The Difference It Makes, 36 Reasons Why Hillary Clinton Should Never Be President. It's available there on the website. If you're a foreign listener and you have trouble reading in English, then you can, of course, select your own language on the website. It's a tool up there at the top right-hand corner and read it in your own native language if it makes it easier. So all of that's available there at BrandonTurbeville.com. And, of course, the archive of this show will be up on the website as well. Now, let's address the Wicked Witch of the West. This is a woman, after all, who has bragged about getting her marching orders from the Council on Foreign Relations, right? For those who might not be familiar in detail with the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR, it's essentially a sister organization to the Royal Institute of International Affairs. It's one of the primary Anglo-American policy developers in the world, and it functions as one of the most effective direct control mechanisms in the world in regards to government-based decisions and governmental policy. It's generally from the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the CFR, as well as the other relevant sister organizations that were set up in nations all across the world, as the British and the French and the other European countries began to pull out of places in the Middle East and Africa and Asia. They left behind these stay-behind organizations like the CFR. They all have different names. And these organizations work in tandem with one another. They're essentially sister organizations. So with these organizations, it's pretty much the direction that the world is going to go that's decided at many of these meetings, and it's implemented through a number of other front organizations and these conferences and publications, foundations, NGOs, and all that kind of stuff. So politicians, senators, congressmen, presidents, prime ministers, parliamentarians, all of them, they attend their relevant organizations' functions. They participate in the discussions that either hold memberships in their CFR-related clubs so they can receive their marching orders like Hillary, And this is how it works, is how it's set up across the world. Now, a list of members and participants of the CFR is much too extensive to reproduce and read on the air. We're not going to do that. But we will just point out that not only is Dick Cheney a member of the CFR, he was actually a director for some period of time. David Rockefeller was chairman of the CFR until Peter G. Peterson, the famous banker and hedge fund hyena and Rothschild associate, took over the position. Robert Rubin later took over the post also, but David Rockefeller has actually remained an honorary chairman ever since for his yeoman service in the creation of world government and worldwide oppression. Now, Hillary, Slick Hilly, is not an official member of the CFR, but she has affiliations with the organization that are abundantly clear, and she admits that herself. July 15th, 2009, Clinton spoke to the Washington, D.C. satellite facility of the CFR, and she stated, quote, "I am delighted to be here in these new headquarters. I have been often to, I guess, the mothership in New York City, but it's good to have an outpost of the council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the council, so this will mean I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future." In quotes. And in that speech, which you can find on YouTube, she went on to address the global agenda, the global consensus, the global architecture of the coming future years. Now, she, again, as I mentioned, she doesn't have an official membership with the CFR, but an invited address to the organization really functions as a means of acceptance into the group. In other words, it's a de facto membership. And whether Hillary's a member or not, her husband certainly is, and so is her daughter. Remember also that when Hillary was appointed as Secretary of State, her own first appointment to the agency was George Mitchell. And he was not only a member of the CFR, but a former director. Mitchell owed the jumpstart of his political career to Jimmy Carter, which was another member of the CFR. So that plays an important role in her political ideology and the manner in which she governs and wishes to govern, and God save us from that eventuality. So we should just see that, you know, her foreign policy and the domestic policies are essentially coming out of places like the Council on Foreign Relations, and you can just read up on that. My article, Hillary Clinton brags about getting her marching orders from the CFR, which is available at BrandonTurbeville.com, is also posted on Activist Post. Now, just a little more about Hillary, and then we'll segue into the next individual that we've got slated for our target here tonight. But there's another Bill in Hillary's life that's important to discuss, and that is Bill Gates, not Bill Clinton, but Bill Gates. The Gates Foundation, those of you who listen regularly might be aware, is most people see Gates as a technology genius or some successful entrepreneur. It's pretty clear that Gates was given the information that he has been able to put out there in general society. It was pretty clear that was handed down to him when you really get down into the research. But the Gates Foundation itself has been hard at work all across the world promoting these dumbed-down education policies, coercive vaccination, genetically modified food, abortion, sterilization, all that kind of stuff. Now, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is one of the 7 largest donors to the Bill, Hillary, and Chelsea Clinton foundations. The both foundations have also partnered together on a number of different initiatives, like the No Ceilings Full Participation Report. We'll get into that later if we have time. But Bill Gates, of course, pretends to care immensely for the poor, particularly in third world countries. But the truth is that his foundation's vaccination and family planning efforts, and we can read family planning as abortion and sterilization, they're not centered around public health. They're based in eugenics and population reduction. Now, it was Gates, remember, who stated publicly, which he will probably forever regret, but this is what he said, quote, "The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%, end quote. So, in addition to that, time and time again, we've seen where international vaccination programs have ended disastrously for third world nations. A case in point is the meningitis vaccine program that resulted in the paralysis of at least 50 African children and a subsequent cover-up operation by the government of Chad. There was a large number of adverse effects that occurred at one small village alone, which left a lot of us to wonder what the rates of the side effects might have been on an international scale. But just in this one village, it was bad enough. So even more concerning than that is the fact that the paralysis rates have flourished in countries where Gates's polio vaccine, the one that he's dedicating his life to, according to his own words, have been administered the most. Right? So India is probably your biggest case example of that. Polio has statistically disappeared from India, but there's been a huge spike in cases of non-polio acute flaccid paralysis. That's NPAFP. The symptoms and the results of this disease, of course, are the very types of problems that the polio virus represented to many people, right? The idea of paralysis and the loss of the use of the proper use of limbs and that sort of thing. But now they're flourishing because there's a new cause, right? There were 47,500 cases of non-polio paralysis reported in 2011. That's the same year that India was declared polio-free, according to Dr. Vashisht and Dr. Puliel, right? So the available data shows that the incidence tracked back to areas where doses of the polio vaccine were frequently administered. So the national rate of NPAFP in India is 25 to 35 times the international average. Now, I don't want to waste too much time discussing the vaccine itself, but it does, it's fairly clear that the polio vaccines are actually the leading cause of polio paralysis in India. In relation to the flawed data reported by the Polio Global Eradication Initiative, which attempts to minimize the number of both vaccine-induced cases of polio paralysis and polio in general, we can look at their statistics where it says there were 42 cases of wild-type polio, that's WPV, is how it would be reported, wild polio virus, in India in 2010. And that indicates that the vaccine-induced cases of polio paralysis, which is 100 to 180 annually, outnumber wild polio cases by a factor of about 3 to 4. So if we put aside the important question of whether or not the Global Eradication Initiative is accurately differentiating between wild and vaccine-associated polio cases in their statistics, we still have to ask ourselves, should the real-world effects of immunization, the good effects or the bad effects, be included in the measurement? I mean, why not, right? Why not unless you're trying to cover something up? So for the dozens of Indian children who develop vaccine-induced paralysis every year, the PGI's declaration of India as nearing polio-free status is not just disingenuous, but it's an attempt to minimize the obvious liability in having transformed polio from a natural disease vector into a man-made iatrogenic one, basically. So, again, I don't want to belabor this point too much, but this is directly related to Gates, right? His polio vaccines have been blamed for deaths and disabilities in Pakistan. A lot of government offices in that country even recommended that the vaccines be suspended. In India, a lot of doctors have heavily criticized the program, not only for the heavy cost to human health and quality of life, but the massive financial burden that's been hoisted upon the state. This is because the program wasn't only partially funded by the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, which is partnered with the World Health Organization and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation and the World Bank and the United Nations. I have a quote here that the doctors criticized the GAVI alliance, and they said, quote, "The Indian government finally had to fund this hugely expensive program, which cost the country 100 times more than the value of the initial grant. From India's perspective, the exercise has been extremely costly, both in terms of human suffering and in monetary terms. It is tempting to speculate what could have been achieved if the $2.5 billion spent on attempting to eradicate polio were spent on water and sanitation and routine immunization. The polio eradication program epitomizes nearly everything that is wrong with donor-funded, disease-specific vertical projects at the cost of investments in community-oriented primary health care, horizontal programs. This is a startling reminder of how initial funding and grants from abroad distort local priorities, end quote. Now, as the doctors point out, you can't simply vaccinate away a disease like polio. Apart from the fact that there's never been a study conducted which proves a vaccine either safe or effective that wasn't connected to a drug company or a vaccine maker, the so-called cure, if it comes under the guise of a vaccine, may well be as bad, if not worse, than the disease itself in this instance. So infection doesn't generally produce symptoms, right? A person rarely exhibits symptoms from being infected with polio. Minor symptoms are actually rare, like sore throat, fever, gastrointestinal disturbances, influenza-like illness. That's very rare, and in only 3% of infections does the virus gain entry to the central nervous system. And then, only in 1 in 5 in 1,000 cases did the infection progress to paralytic disease. So, due to the fact that polio actually spreads through the fecal-oral route, in other words, the virus is transmitted from the stool of an infected person to the mouth of another person through whatever means that is, whether a contaminated object like utensil or something like that. It's not vaccines that should be focused on. It's hygiene. It's sanitation. It's proper nutrition to support the immune system. It's a logical way to prevent transmission in the first place, and that's going to reduce not only that, but the morbidity associated with an infection when it does occur. So a large portion of the world's vaccines, of course, are given to the third world as charity when the underlying conditions of economic impoverishment and economic hardship and poor nutrition and chemical exposures and socio-political unrest, those are never addressed. And those are actually going to be your biggest causes of a lot of these infections and the spread of those infections. So it's not a lack of vaccination, but it's poor sanitation standards, it's poverty, it's lower living standards, it's chemical pollution, it's a lack of proper nutrition. If we spent money correcting these issues, and that's going to be in our list of demands that we're going to be talking about in the near future, if we spent money correcting these issues as opposed to providing these ineffective and dangerous vaccinations, then polio and another group of diseases, most of these other diseases, are going to be eradicated. Now, the answer is about raising living standards. It's about reducing pollution. It's about increasing knowledge and access to proper nutrition and clean drinking water, not chemical and virus-laden needles. Now, I guess Bill Gates says this is God's work that he's doing, right? Well, I think eliminating the list of negative situations in the human experience that I just mentioned is more God's work than promoting toxic vaccines to third world people who are generally unsuspecting as to what's in them. Now, the connection between Gates and Clinton, this is especially in regards to population reduction initiatives. That's no surprise because it's, Hillary Clinton who proudly announced that the population control policies would become the centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy when she spoke to the International Conference on Population and Development, the 15th anniversary of that organization. This is what she says, quote, "This year, the United States renewed funding of reproductive health care through the United Nations Population Fund, and more funding is on the way." She got a standing applause, of course. "The U.S. Congress recently appropriated more than $648 million in foreign assistance to family planning and reproductive health programs worldwide. That is the largest allocation in more than a decade since we last had a Democratic president, I might add," end quote. So she admits all that. Gates, we also should mention his Common Core program. This is monstrous wealth of stupidity and confounding nonsense. It's of course a connecting tissue between Clinton and Gates. So, what Clinton has attempted to dodge some of the criticism and the fire surrounding Common Core from parents and teachers who see the program for what it really is. She's openly stated that she supports the program. So, there we have it. Now, if you're interested in looking at the connections between Hillary and Bill Gates, just go to my article, Hillary and Bill Gates, and you can find it there. And it's going to be at brandonturbeville.com. But just a few more words on Bill Gates. For anybody out there who thinks that Bill Gates is some type of humanitarian or genuine philanthropist, I would encourage you to pay attention to what I'm about to point out here. Remember, Bill Gates has backed and promoted temporary sterilization microchips in women, right? This is his lifelong family tradition of promoting sterilization and the legacy of Planned Parenthood. Gates has launched a pretty ambitious plan to push the development of microchips which would temporarily sterilize women. So the same developers who are bringing wireless remote-controlled microchip implants are now focused on their, a new flagship product, and that's the Gates Foundation-funded birth control microchip implants. It's a wireless technology that allows the remote-controlled chip to turn on a woman's ability to conceive off and on at will. That's temporary sterilization. So, of course, with remote technology funded by eugenics depopulation fanatics, the first question would always be the ability to conceive by whose will, right? This would be the complete antithesis of female empowerment or a woman's right to choose, wouldn't it? I mean, that only stands to reason, but this guy is, of course, got the power of the social justice warriors behind him, so it's not likely that he's going to be called out on that. So the encryption is alleged to be so safe that cyber hackers can't break entry. That means, of course, you too, even if you're the woman. So the chip can be implanted into the hip, the arms, beneath the back, and nobody said anything over the last few years of development until it was finally publicly confirmed that the beta testing for the birth control chip would be started towards the end of 2015. So keeping in line with the eugenics fanaticism, Gates is going to be targeting women in the third world countries like India and Africa to test the chip on them before introducing it to the greater commercial market. Not that it's even necessary in the West, because apparently nobody in the West has children and replenishes themselves anymore. But remember, the traditional medicine in India has been around there for many, many years, and now Gates is waging war on that. So we must add this to his list of crimes, right? That he's waging war on traditional medicine in India. When it comes to forceful health initiatives, especially those that are sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, India really is the new Africa, because another Gates-funded initiative that is using influence, to ferret out true believer health officials, leverage their influence for social manipulation, all that kind of stuff, paint the culture as uneducated, convince them to get with the Western health program. All of that stuff is in the works. That's how they get their tentacles and their grips onto local officials. An ongoing study of cultural behavior is described in the paper Integrating Social Networks and Human Social Motives to Achieve Social Influence at Scale. That was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. That's September 15th, 2014. So the idea is to pair social networks with social motives to close the science gap. Close the science gap is their terminology. In other words, to put authoritative findings into direct action and overcome cultural resistance or caution. It's essentially a wide-reaching and deep-acting propaganda system to heavily influence neonatal care in India. So, and there's an example that's used in the study, and it focuses on convincing Indian mothers that applying a topical solution of chlorhexidine to cleanse a newborn's umbilical cord reduced the neonatal mortality rate by 24%. But to the chagrin of Gates-backed researchers, many Indian parents didn't receive or follow this information. They stuck to their method of mustard oil. It's an Ayurvedic solution that's becoming more popular in the U.S. for its stimulation of the circulation system. But it's interesting that it's observation of human beings like they're lab rats. It's an effort to try and break them of their culture It talks about using tactics of knowledge management and using influencers to get people to change. This has been used all over the world, by the way, and it's being used over here. So these tactics are, of course, essentially brainwashing techniques, and it's very similar to what was used on other individuals. So we need to look at also, I mentioned his vaccination program being God's work. He clearly thinks high of this, of his vaccination fanaticism. Remember, with the London Telegraph, Bill Gates claimed that his foundation massive push for vaccination is not just an exercise in philanthropy, but it's actually God's work. And Gates is estimated to be worth about $65 billion. That's the estimate, the official estimate. I'm sure there's more than that. He says he's dedicating his life to the eradication of poliomyelitis. At least he's dedicating himself to the vaccination program. That's what we've just discussed. This is what Gates says. My wife and I had a long dialogue about how we were going to take the wealth that we're lucky enough to have and give it back in a way that's most impactful to the world. Both of us worked at Microsoft and saw that if you take innovation and smart people, the ability to measure what's working, that you can pull together some pretty dramatic things. We're focused on the help of the poorest of the world, which really drives you into vaccination. You can actually take a disease and get rid of it altogether, like we are doing with polio. Well, we've already discussed what he's been doing with polio, so I'm not going to go back over that. Now, there's also the question, since we're talking about vaccines, the malaria vaccine flop, which he was involved with. It's not even been his very good public relations experience for Gates. Now, it was a minor public relations setback, but it was a public relations setback nonetheless, especially for not only Bill, but GlaxoSmithKline. They had this Mosquirix malaria vaccine that they rolled out in Africa that has been officially demonstrated to only be 30% effective in babies. So officially, it's only 30% effective. And results from the final stage trial that was administered by GSK appeared to demonstrate that the vaccine only provided modest protection. That's their own words, modest protection for babies aged 6 to 12 weeks. And it had a reduction in the contraction of the disease by only 30%, which is a much lower number than what had been touted by the ones that were promoting it in the industry and the corporate media. So Reuters had a report that showed that children after the age of 6 months, there was a 65% rate being established for children 5 to 17 months. The researchers claim there was a protection of around 50%. Now, Reuters dubbed that a surprisingly poor result for the vaccine, and this is what Bill Gates stated. The efficacy came back lower than we had hoped, but developing a vaccine against a parasite is a very hard thing to do. Well, that's correct, that it's difficult to create a vaccine for a protozoan, which is the type of parasite that causes malaria. That's because the vaccines don't work against parasites. They're not even designed to work against parasites. Protozoans they're a parasite. Vaccines are designed to protect against viruses. So the Mosquirix vaccine enters into this growing science of DNA vaccines. It's a research field which is expanding, but the science is still very out and very much in regards to effectiveness and safety or even possibility. Now, I imagine at the higher levels, we know at the higher levels they understand this stuff pretty well, but at the levels of which it's being rolled out to the public, these are much different levels of science. So, GSK did announce that it wouldn't be giving up with the attempt to develop Mosquirix, but they would create it in a more effective form, more effective vaccine. They're going to be working with governments and international groups to fund the operation. So GSK, of course, claimed that it didn't plan to make a profit from Mosquirix. Yeah, right. It admits that it was going to be charging a 5% profit margin on the product, but it won't be making a profit, of course. So the funding for development and rollout would be coming from the governments and the international groups that we just discussed, meaning that it's the cash-strapped taxpayer who's going to shovel out the cash for another eugenics program aimed at poor Africans. So that's what that is. Now, remember, Gates also promotes the cashless society. a lot of questionable campaigns by Gates, not related to vaccines, but things like the Better Than Cash Alliance and the push for cashless society. We have an article by Peter McCoy in Bloomberg Business Week from some time ago revealing that Bill Gates is actually opposed to physical cash currency because I guess like vaccine-free populations who are able to determine their own reproduction rates, it hurts poor people, according to Bill Gates. If you're able to make a choice about whether or not you want to have a child, that hurts poor people. If you use cash, it hurts poor people. That's Bill Gates' version of the race card, I guess. So the McCoy article says that Gates hates cash because of its effect on people at the opposite end of the wealth spectrum, the world's poor and unbanked. Unbanked is what he refers to them. So, of course, in third world countries that are suffering from starvation and civil war and abysmal living standards, the answer, according to Gates, is banking. Well, starvation, civil war, and abysmal living standards are generally the direct result of banking. But we all know that. According to Gates, though, if these nations had more banks and greater access to banks, the private banks, of course, not national government banks, but we'd finally be able to see the living standards of these nations raised to acceptable levels. If more people had access to digital transactions, the empty bellies would be filled, according to Gates. But sarcasm aside, the push toward a cashless society under the guise of benefiting the poor and undeserved is a very real movement. And as McCoy points out in that article, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has been instrumental in this regard as major backers of the Better Than Cash Alliance, which is established for the sole purpose of eliminating cash. It was back in September of 2015, I believe. They have these stated objectives. I'll read you some of the stated objectives. Significant commitments by governments, the development community, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector to implement electronic payment solutions instead of cash. Delivery of demand-driven technical assistance to governments, non-governmental organizations, the development community, or members of the private sector that will dramatically increase the capacity of these stakeholders to deliver end-user-focused payments technologies. Improved economic security for millions of low-income and poor people, many of whom were previously unbanked, enabling them to use bank or electronic accounts to build savings and assets via innovative payment ideologies. Okay, so that's some of their objectives. Now, the Better Than Cash Alliance, their founding members and their financiers boast of a list of organizations that have had their own histories in the past, all the way back to the present time. But the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, of course, instrumental population reduction initiatives I've discussed, vaccination programs, the abortion and sterilization, all that other stuff, abortion and sterilization. There's, of course, Citi, that's the major international bank who was intricately involved in the 2008 derivatives crisis. I've got the Ford Foundation. Representatives of the Ford Foundation, remember, actually stated to the Reese Commission Chief Investigator Norman Dodd that the goal of the foundation was to comfortably merge the United States with the Soviet Union. That should be this should never be forgotten. And of course, there's also the Omidyar Network. There's Visa. Visa, of course, long been interested in creating a cashless society. But it's got more than just corporate and private sector sponsors. One of the key founding members of financiers is, in fact, the U.S. Agency for International Development. Remember, my listeners are going to be very familiar with that. That's a government agency that answers directly to the U.S. Secretary of State. It's been understood for a long time that USAID is nothing more than the CIA front operation for intelligence gathering and as a facilitation mechanism for CIA funding of foreign governments and organizations. It's heavily involved in color revolutions as well. So in addition to that, the financier and founder roster has the United Nations Capital Development Fund, the UNCDF, the UN's Capital Investment Agency, reserved for use with the least developed nations, so it's a special target agency. They also have the World Food Program, Mercy Corps, Concern Worldwide, and CARE. The governments that are taking part in this alliance are Afghanistan, the Department of Social Prosperity, and the government of Colombia, the Republic of Kenya, Republic of Peru, Republic of the Philippines. So it's very clear what Gates is involved with there. And of course, remember, it's not only that, right? The vaccines we've already discussed. Something that it's more funny than anything else, but the super condom. I hope it's just more funny than anything else. 2013, Bill Gates had this program. It was a $100,000 reward that was offered by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation via the Grand Challenges, a global health program, to anybody that would be able to create a condom that would be easier to wear and more cleverly packaged, or one that would be able to overcome cultural differences. So that's one of the few that we can say, well, okay, good luck with that, Bill. Nobody's going to argue against the creation of a better prophylactic, but considering the history, we know that it's focused more on preventing births than protecting sexually active adults from diseases. But whatever on that. There's two more here I want to mention. Bill Gates has bought stock in Monsanto. In 2010, it was revealed that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was joining with the notorious big agri companies Monsanto and Cargill so they could promote genetically modified foods in Africa. Gates has long supported GMOs across the world, but in 2010, there was a direct connection between their production and promotion with the foundation's purchase of 500,000 shares of Monsanto stock. And with Cargill, the foundation teamed up for a $10 million project to, quote, develop the soya value chain in Mozambique and in a number of other countries. So, lastly, the toilet poop water. Bill Gates and the toilet poop water. The title of that type is kind of funny, but the goal really isn't. It's I think this was last year actually. Bill Gates, via the Gates Foundation, launched another philanthropic program to clean water for hundreds of million people who live without clean water, and this was something called the Omni Processor. It was a giant machine that can turn human waste into clean drinking water in minutes. Now, you might wonder why Gates didn't promote a giant machine that simply treated the water that was there, or developed a relatively simple concept into a technology that removes salt from water in coastal areas, desalination. But, you would think with sea levels rising, that would be a legitimate concern. But instead, Gates wanted to focus on producing clean drinking water through feces and urine. So, is it impressive science? Yeah, absolutely. But it's also a colossal waste of time and a colossal waste of money, considering the large number of other simpler and more affordable options available. So I just wanted to mention that as well. Now, that's Bill Gates. Back in November of last year, it was Bill Gates turned 60, and they were doing all of these retrospectives for Bill in the mainstream media. So we wrote one of our own. This was actually... There's an article written by Heather Callahan of Activist Post and Natural Blaze, and it's entitled Bill Gates at 60, an alternative retrospective that I would encourage you to go take a look at. Now, I want to mention some positive news here as well, despite the fact that the Iowa caucuses are, that have taken place earlier today, and the dreadful situation in the presidential elections. We have a new candidate that is running in Napa County, California, and this is James Hinton. He ran for Senate in California a while back. He was actually a guest on this program when he was running for Senate, but now he's thrown his hat into the race. This is for Napa Valley County Board of Supervisors, District 2, and he's trying to turn things around there as well. Remember, one of the most fascist health care laws ever passed, SB 277, the forced vaccination bill in California, it made California ground zero for the health freedom fight. And, of course, James Hinton is trying to fight SB 277. And he also has a number of principles for some of the programs that I've laid out on this show as well. So he's using some of that. He's trying to raise the minimum wage in Napa County. He's trying to end glyphosate pollution. He's trying to repeal Napa's medical marijuana ban. And for those of you who don't know, California passed the medical marijuana law, right? So medical marijuana is legal in California, but the counties, some of the counties are actually going around and trying to ban it in their county through local legislation. Again, this just kind of proves what I've stated before in the past in regards to this idea of total decentralization, the states' rights arguments, the local government's rights arguments. It shows that this does not work because you're essentially supplanting federal tyranny for local tyranny, and tyranny is tyranny. So we don't want to support tyranny. So anyway, James Hinton, he wants to raise the minimum wage in Napa County, end glyphosate pollution, repeal Napa's medical marijuana ban. He's also attempted to convince the Napa Valley Unified School District to adopt a resolution urging the legislature to extend the personal beliefs exception deadline to July 1st of 2016. That was a plan modeled after the Orange County Department of Education's earlier decision. He's fighting SB 277, but that's an extension for people who are having their kids in school right now. It's essentially it's step one. Now, he's also urging the Napa Valley Unified School District to follow in the footsteps of the Sausalito Marin City School District and adopt a program similar to the Conscious Kitchen that provides Marin City students with clean, organic, local food on a daily basis. Now, we have an article that quotes Steve Van Zandt, who is the Marin District Superintendent. This is what he says about the program. The results speak for themselves. Since launching the pilot at Bayside MLK Academy in 2013, students are eating real food for breakfast and lunch. Discipline cases has dropped dramatically. Attendance has improved. Food waste is down. And students and teachers sharing of meals has led to improved manners and open communication, greatly enhancing the school community. So that just proves what we've seen these pilot programs before. It's one in Wisconsin and had the same results. So Hinton is encouraging the Napa Valley Unified School District to do that, to implement that program. And that's something that we should want to see implemented here in our schools as well, not just in Napa County. But if you're interested in Hinton's campaign, then go to jameshinton.org, and that's JamesHinton.org, and that's his website. You can follow him on Twitter at Hinton2016, and his Facebook page, Hinton for Napa. And the links are all in my article that are on BrandonTurbeville.com, also Natural Blaze. California County Board of Supervisors candidate goes after Monsanto, SB 277. So go check that out and go check out his campaign. Now, last week I mentioned Mark Baker of Baker's Green Acres. It's a farm in Michigan that he announced that he was closing the farm down. He's been fighting the regulatory agencies there as well. He hasn't been doing anything wrong, mind you. These are out-of-control regulatory agencies that have been targeting him for a number of years, and he reached the end of his rope and recently announced that he was going to close the farm down. He was giving up. He couldn't take it anymore. But recently, he made an announcement that he is actually going to keep the farm open. So he's rethought his decision, and it's going to be open, but in a slightly different capacity. Instead of a business enterprise, Baker's Green Acres is going to be converted to an operation that exists for the purpose of helping veterans to rebuild their lives after serving in combat. As opposed to, focusing on production and commerce, the farm is going to be focused on education and rehabilitation. So it's going to be there. Baker was a 20-year military veteran himself. So if you're interested in that, again, BrandonTurbeville.com, NaturalBlaze.com. Baker's Green Acres Farm will reopen for veterans to rebuild lives after combat. And if you want to get in touch with him and see how you can help his efforts, you can do that through that article that you'll be able to find his website and so forth. Now, we should also mention the fact that, not to toot our own horn here, but my work was featured on a very popular Greek blog, Atikania, and it was written by Popi Soufli on January 11th, 2016, and that's up at my website, the post is there, but it's in Greek. So if you're able to read Greek, then you can read that article. But it was very popular there in Greece when it was released. So we want to thank Popoli for the coverage, and it's greatly appreciated. Now let's transition in the time we have left over for foreign affairs, for Syria, for the Middle East, and that sphere of things. We haven't been as focused on that this year simply because we've been trying to focus our efforts on preventing the Wicked Witch of the West from getting the Democratic nomination. We've been trying to prevent that in hopes that we can have some effect. But now we cannot ignore the situation, so we have to discuss it, right? So on January 26th of this year, we had 2 suicide bombings in Homs. That's a province there in Syria, Homs province. And we want to ask, was this a moderate rebel, Obama? Was this a moderate rebel, Robert Ford? Maybe it was one of the terrorists who were repatriated back into Syrian society, right? It was another moderate cannibal at work. Apparently, this guy parked his car bomb on the side of the road in Zahra suburb, and he detonated the bomb by remote control, and apparently gained an audience there who were going to watch this monkey demonstrate his ability to push a button. And he actually had a suicide vest on himself, and he blew himself up and killed the people who were standing around. This suburb has been targeted more than 60 times since the beginning of this destabilization that our U.S. State Department would refer to as the Arab Spring or the rebellion or civil war. The demographic there is mostly Alawite. Of course, there's also people from all religions. This is Syria, after all. So about 24 people were killed. At least those were the last numbers that I saw. Many of the bodies weren't even able to be identified. And these bombings conveniently tend to take place in different Syrian provinces, conveniently before any peace talks, like the one that's being held in Geneva, begin. And this is just a sampling of the convenient nature of these bombings that take place before these peace talks. Now, we mentioned in an article Afra Dagher, who writes for her own website, syrianaafrana.wordpress.com. She is in Syria right now. She's a Syrian in Syria, and she writes about these topics, and I post her work occasionally on my website, and she's been a guest on this show. She not only pointed out that obviously condemned the terrorist acts. She's firmly opposed to these so-called rebels, but also that the provincial leadership, there was malfeasance here. There's this idea that in order to achieve peace and an end to the violence, many of these so-called rebels are part of what's called conciliation or reconciliation or conciliation with the Syrian government. In other words, they can put down their arms and either join the Syrian military or promise not to fight and rejoin Syrian society. And this plan sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't. There's also the question of the explosive devices that were left behind. There did not appear to be a great attempt to clean the area of the explosive devices. And there also has to be some type of attempt to determine who really is assimilated back into Syrian society and who retains the Takfiri mentality. And this is what Afra called for in her article, and I seconded that when it came out. But thankfully, my reports are coming from Syria now that the individuals who were derelict in their duties to do all that they could to stop these types of things from happening have now been removed. And they've been replaced by more competent officials, or at least hopefully more competent officials in Homs to prevent this from happening. So there is that. So there's been some improvement in that area as well. Now, of course, the Rumelan Air Force Base in Syria, whether it's the carrot of the promise of their own Syrian Kurdistan, or whether it's the stick of the threat to work with Turkey to start bombing and killing the YPG forces if they didn't cooperate with NATO, the U.S. has apparently brought the YPG around to its way of thinking. Remember, the YPG has always been kind of on the fence. They are not as the Iraqi Kurds, the Iraqi Barzani Kurds, which are entirely controlled by the Western intelligence agencies and by the Israelis, not like the PKK, which are more so their own autonomous force that are opposed to the Turks. The YPG is somewhat, I don't know if we can say that they're more stealthy in terms of the way they accept help, but the YPG is always going back and forth. They're either an autonomous group, but they will be willing to work with the Syrian government. They're willing to work with the Russians. They're willing to work with the United States. And with that, in order to achieve their own goals, of course, but with that, they've got their own goals, and each one of these individual states has their own goals, and NATO, of course, has its overarching goal. So this presents a number of geopolitical considerations that tend to be contradictory at times. So we have a number of reports from media outlets, and we're going to talk more about that in the coming weeks, the YPG and the Kurdish issue as well. But we've got a number of reports from media outlets like Al Jazeera and Foreign Policy that the United States is now taking control of the Rumelan air base in northeastern Syria in the Hasaka province. And this information was first reported after a Syrian Democratic Forces spokesperson told Al Jazeera that U.S. troops have taken control of the air base in order to assist the SDF in their fight against ISIS, right? Well, fight against ISIS, we think not, regardless of why they seized the base, not a fight against ISIS. The SDF, of course, the SDF is really mostly Kurdish, but it's also got members of the Free Syrian Army and other moderate cannibal groups that are fighting Assad, right, and allegedly ISIS. But we know they're not fighting ISIS except in petty squabbles. It's SDF. We can just put them in the group of the moderate terrorists, right? It's been supported by the United States anyway. So Hasaka and the Rumelan Air Base are specifically located in the northeastern tip of Syria. It's close to the Iraqi and Turkish borders, that tip right there at the northeastern part. So it's a strategic location. Now we've got Taj Kordish, the SDF spokesman. He told Al Jazeera, quote, "Under a deal with the YPG, the U.S. was given control of the airport. The purpose of this deal is to back up the SDF by providing weapons and an air base for U.S. warplanes. This airport was previously controlled by the YPG for over 2 years now. This strategic airport is close to several oil bases, one of the biggest in this area. Rumelan Airport was previously used for agricultural purposes by the Syrian government," end quote. So we've got the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, the notoriously discredited human rights watchdog agency, stating that the airfield is still in the process of being prepared by U.S. forces. The U.S. State Department, the U.S. CENTCOM neither confirmed nor denied the reports at the time. They've since denied those reports. But it's unclear as to whether or not the YPG is working with the United States because it's been promised an independent Kurdistan in northern Syria, or whether it's been bullied or blackmailed into doing that out of the fear of being facing combined military weight of the Turks and the Americans and ISIS. So it's possible that the Kurds are willing, as they've said in the past, to partner with anybody, anytime, anywhere to achieve their own agenda, their own goals. But whatever the case is, it's clear that there's a multi-layered cast of intrigue and geopolitical concerns at play here. One thing we know for sure, though, is not up for question or debate, is that the United States is violating national sovereignty. They are violating human rights. They are violating international law if they are taking over the Rumelan air base. And, of course, we also have reports that the Russians are now looking at another air base as well in Syria. So we're seeing a situation in which Russian air bases, U.S. air bases, former Syrian bases are now becoming Russian and U.S. bases there in Syria, right on the border with the Turks, who are massing troops upon the border. Are we seeing more troop placement, more chess playing here set up for an actual direct military confrontation? We don't know. But it's something to definitely pay attention to. just a few more words about the situation in Syria, though, with the Kurds. John Laughlin once said it's better to be an enemy of the Americans than their friend, because if you're their enemy, they might try to buy you, but if you're their friend, they will definitely try to sell you. And you might not be able to apply that logic to every interaction with the United States, but it's a lesson that the YPG Kurds could be learning in Syria, or they could be trying to perpetuate it. It's still a little murky. So, as I mentioned a second ago, the YPG has long been considered to be one of the warmer forces in terms of its relationship to the United States, but it's not the equivalent of the Iraqi Barzani Kurds, who are essentially connected to the NATO intelligence apparatus. The YPG has been willing to accept help from anybody who's interested in defeating ISIS, whether that's the Syrian government or the United States. But the YPG is interested in setting up its own Kurdistan, and that's clear. That's clear. So, whether the YPG was unable to see that the U.S. assistance in the fight against ISIS was nothing more than a smokescreen for American support of the organization, ISIS itself, or whether the YPG was willing to work with the United States because it believed that by doing so it eventually sees a Kurdistan in northern Syria, we don't know at the time, but the YPG could have outlived its usefulness to the United States, or it seems to have been bribed at this point now, right? Because we also have, at one point there was this announcement that the U.S. was throwing the Kurds to the wolves, right? That it was launching a program with Turkey to roll back Kurdish, not ISIS, advances in Syria. And that means the YPG. It's not the PKK, it's not the Barzanis, it is the YPG. Now, shortly after that, we see that the United States is eyeing this Ramallah air base, and they are doing so with the blessing of the Kurds, who essentially turned that base over to them. Now, let's put two and two together. Let's look at the situation. The YPG wants Kurdistan. The Turks want to destroy the YPG, and they've been bombing the YPG in the past. The United States works with the YPG, but doesn't fully control them. So the U.S. requests an air base. They say, we want the Ramallah air base in Syria, and the Kurds say no. And the United States says, fine, we'll agree with Turkey. And this is hypothetical here, but you could get the idea of how this type of stuff works. So the Kurds say no, and the U.S. says, well, we'll work with Turkey. We're going to get this base one way or the other. And you know who supports ISIS, so the Kurds are going to bomb you, and we are going to work with the Kurds in order to do that. So the Kurds change their tune. You can have the air base. Now, I'm not saying this is exactly what happened, but I'm giving you a hypothetical case of how these types of developments actually take place in these types of situations. In other words, that the Kurds want a Kurdistan, but the United States has blackmailed and bullied them and said, we're going to get this base, or we're going to allow the Turks to attack you, we're going to assist the Turks in doing it. And so the Kurds realize that it's a better idea to have the U.S. on that base than to start a war with the U.S. and with the Turks. And the U.S., of course, can maintain influence over the YPG. Now they've got even more leverage because that base is there. It also opens up the question because the YPG has suggested that they can and might work with Russia at some point. So you may have competing interests coming in to play with the YPG, and that's going to be very important in the coming months, which we will be discussing in the coming weeks. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.TV.